There's a particular kind of arrogance that comes with never having to struggle, a certain way people carry themselves when they believe they're naturally superior, as if life has chosen them to be special while the rest of us are just background characters in their perfect little world. My sister Olivia was one of those people, the type who had never lifted a finger for anything in her life but still managed to look down on those of us who did. She was the kind of person who scoffed at minimum wage workers while demanding exceptional service, the kind who bragged about designer bags that she never paid for, the kind who judged people by the cars they drove, the clothes they wore, the brands they could afford, and most of all by how much money they made. Growing up, Olivia and I had always been different, not just in the way we saw the world but in the way the world saw us. She had always been the golden child, the one who turned heads when she walked into a room, the one who got everything she wanted without ever having to ask twice. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the one who never cared much for appearances, the one who worked hard because I had to, because I didn't believe in handouts, because I knew that nothing worth having ever came easy. She thought that made me boring, thought my life was small and pathetic, thought that anyone who spent their time working a regular job instead of chasing luxury was just another failure waiting to happen. For years, I let it slide, let her condescending comments roll off my back, let her laugh at the way I spent my days, let her tell me that I was wasting my potential working at a company when I should be doing something important. She would sip her overpriced cocktails and smirk at me across the dinner table, tossing out lines like, "You really need to stop thinking so small, Daniel, or I could never live like you. I'd rather die than work some boring job for the rest of my life." She always said it with a laugh, like it was just harmless teasing, like she didn't realize, or didn't care, how much of an insult it really was. The worst part wasn't the words themselves, but the way she truly believed them, the way she looked at me with that thinly veiled pity, like she had already written my story for me, like she had already decided that I was destined to be nothing more than another faceless worker in the grand machine of life. And maybe, for a while, I let her believe that, let her think she had it all figured out, let her carry on with her little fantasy where she was important and I was insignificant, because at the end of the day, what did it really matter what she thought? Then came the dinner that changed everything. It was supposed to be a simple family gathering, the kind we had every few months where my mother tried to keep the peace and pretend that everything was fine, the kind where Olivia showed up late, dressed in something expensive, with stories about her latest vacation or her newest designer purchase, expecting us all to marvel at how effortlessly glamorous her life was. And as always, she wasted no time making sure I knew exactly where I stood in comparison to her.
Hello everyone, I am very glad that you're joining this story. Subscribe, like and comment. Enjoy the story, smile more often.
"So, Daniel," she said, swirling her wine glass in that way she always did when she was about to say something condescending, "still working that same little job of yours?" I didn't react, just picked up my fork and took a slow bite of my food, refusing to give her the satisfaction of a response. She smirked, leaning forward slightly, her voice dripping with fake concern. "You know, it's never too late to start thinking bigger," she continued, flashing a glance at our mother, as if expecting her to agree. "I just hate seeing you waste your life in some tiny office when you could be doing something real with your time." My mother sighed, giving me a look that practically begged me not to take the bait, but I could already feel the heat rising in my chest, the familiar irritation settling in my bones, the anger clawing its way up my throat like a wildfire waiting to spread. I set my fork down carefully, exhaling slowly, keeping my voice calm. "And what exactly do you think I should be doing, Olivia?" She tilted her head, smiling like she had just been waiting for me to ask. "I don't know," she mused, tapping her manicured nails against the table. "Something exciting, something that actually makes real money. I mean, I just don't get how you're okay with being so average." Average. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and deliberate, a single syllable packed with enough judgment to cut straight through bone. I could feel my mother tense beside me, could see the way her fingers tightened around her napkin, her silent plea for me to just let it go, to ignore it the way I always had before. But something about the way Olivia said it this time, the way she looked at me like I was some kind of disappointment, some kind of lesser being, made something inside me snap. I could have told her the truth right then and there, could have wiped that smug expression off her face with a single sentence, could have watched the color drain from her cheeks as she realized just how wrong she had been about me. But instead I just smiled, leaning back in my chair, tilting my head slightly as I studied her, as I let her believe, just for a little while longer, that she had already won. "Maybe you're right," I said smoothly, watching as her smirk widened, as she settled back into her usual self-satisfied confidence. "Maybe I should start thinking bigger." She laughed, raising her glass in a mock toast. "Finally, something we agree on," she said, taking a sip of her wine, completely unaware that the game she had been playing for so long was about to turn against her in a way she never saw coming. Because what Olivia didn't know, what she had never even bothered to consider, was that the boring little job she had spent years mocking wasn't just some dead-end position, wasn't just some paycheck-to-paycheck existence, wasn't just another rung on the ladder to nowhere. What she didn't know was that the company she had spent so much time looking down on, the one she thought was beneath her, the one she had no respect for, was mine. And when she came crawling back, when life finally knocked her down from the pedestal she had built for herself, when she found herself desperate and scrambling for the kind of stability she had once taken for granted, she would walk straight into the last place she ever expected. Straight into my company. Straight into my office. Straight into my world. And when that day came, I was going to make damn sure she never forgot it. There's a particular kind of silence that follows a disaster. A strange, hollow emptiness that settles in when the shock hasn't quite worn off yet, when the mind is still struggling to process the fact that everything has just fallen apart. Olivia had spent her entire life moving through the world as if she were untouchable, convinced that her beauty, charm, and expensive taste would always keep her safe, would always guarantee her a place among the wealthy and powerful, would always ensure that she would never have to live the kind of life she so openly despised. But life has a way of humbling even the most arrogant, and when the ground finally crumbled beneath her feet, she realized, too late, that she had never actually learned how to stand on her own. It all started with Ryan, the fiancé she had paraded around like a trophy, the man she had always spoken about as if he were a walking bank vault, the one who had given her access to the kind of life she had always dreamed of. Lavish vacations, designer wardrobes, exclusive parties where the guest lists were filled with people she was desperate to impress. For years, she had worn his wealth like armor, had used his money to craft the perfect image, had convinced herself that as long as she had him, she would always be secure, always be admired, always be envied. Then, in the span of a single conversation, it was gone. I wasn't there when it happened, but I heard about it soon enough, the news making its way through family gossip like wildfire, the kind of scandal that people whispered about behind closed doors, the kind of downfall that was just juicy enough for even the most polite relatives to discuss with thinly veiled amusement. Olivia had been blindsided, had gone into what she thought was just another dinner with Ryan, expecting another expensive meal, another evening of effortless luxury, only to walk away single, humiliated, and suddenly very, very alone. Ryan had been brutally direct, the way only men like him could be. Men who saw relationships as transactions, as investments, as something that needed to provide a return in order to be worth maintaining. "This just isn't working for me anymore," he had said. His tone casual, detached, completely indifferent to the fact that he was shattering the foundation of Olivia's carefully curated life. "You're becoming more trouble than you're worth, and honestly, I think it's time we both move on." Trouble. That was the word that broke her, the word that stayed with her long after the dinner ended, long after she had walked out of that restaurant in a daze, long after she had tried and failed to call him back. It wasn't that he had fallen out of love with her because love had never really been part of the equation to begin with. It was that she had stopped being a good investment, had stopped being convenient, had stopped fitting so perfectly into the image he wanted for himself. And for the first time in her life, Olivia had to face the ugly truth she had spent years ignoring. She wasn't special to him, wasn't irreplaceable, wasn't anything more than another pretty face in a world filled with younger, newer, shinier options. I saw the cracks forming before she did. Saw the way her smiles started looking forced. Saw the way she avoided certain questions. Saw the way her confidence wavered just slightly whenever money was mentioned. She still tried to keep up appearances, still walked into every room with her head held high, still posted carefully staged photos on social media, pretending that nothing had changed. But pretending didn't pay the bills, and the bills were piling up faster than she could ignore them. First, it was the rent on her overpriced apartment, the one she had insisted on keeping even after Ryan stopped covering the payments, convinced that she would find another way to afford it before it became a problem. Then it was the credit cards, the one she had used so carelessly for years, assuming that there would always be another deposit coming, another generous boyfriend willing to take care of things, another easy way out. And then, finally, it was the realization that, for the first time in her life, she was well and truly on her own. She tried to reach out to friends, the same people she had once laughed with at exclusive events, the same women who had spent years competing with her over who had the most expensive bag, the most luxurious vacation, the most perfect life. But the thing about people like that, people who thrived on wealth and status, was that they had no patience for failure, no interest in those who had fallen from grace, no loyalty to anyone who couldn't offer them something in return. They stopped answering her calls, stopped inviting her out, stopped pretending to care the moment they realized she had nothing left to give. And that was when the panic set in. I remember the exact moment she realized how bad things had gotten, the exact second the weight of reality finally hit her. She had come over to my mother's house for dinner, something she had never done unless she needed something, unless she was trying to play the role of the dutiful daughter long enough to gain sympathy, long enough to secure whatever favor she had decided she was entitled to. But that night she wasn't playing a role. She was unraveling, and for the first time she wasn't trying to hide it. "I just need some time to figure things out," she had said, stirring her untouched food with a fork, her voice softer than usual, her usual arrogance nowhere to be found. "Things have been complicated lately." I had watched her from across the table, waiting to see if she would say it, if she would admit the truth, if she would finally acknowledge that her perfect life had fallen apart. But Olivia had never been good at admitting defeat, had never been good at swallowing her pride, had never been good at looking anyone in the eye and saying the words "I was wrong." So I had just nodded, playing along, letting her hold onto whatever scraps of dignity she had left, because I knew it wouldn't be long before she had no choice but to face the truth. And sure enough, 2 weeks later, she did something I never thought I would see. She started looking for a job. Not because she wanted to. Not because she had suddenly discovered a passion for hard work. Not because she had finally realized the value of earning her own way in life. But because, for the first time, she had no other choice. She was broke. She was alone. And she was desperate. And as I watched her scroll through job listings, looking more and more frustrated with each passing minute, I knew that the universe had finally done what I never could. Taught Olivia the lesson she had spent her entire life refusing to learn. She had spent years looking down on people like me. People who worked for a living. People who didn't rely on handouts. People who didn't expect the world to cater to their every whim. Now, she was about to become one of us. And the best part. She had no idea whose company she was about to walk into. Audience question. If someone who always looked down on you was suddenly struggling, would you help them or let them learn the hard way? Olivia had never worked a single day in her life, had never filled out a job application, had never sat through an interview, had never once worried about a paycheck, and yet, here she was, staring at a screen filled with job listings, trying to convince herself that this was just a temporary setback and not the beginning of a long, painful fall from grace. She still carried herself with that same air of entitlement, still believed deep down that someone, somewhere, would recognize how special she was and hand her the life she had lost, still assumed that all she needed to do was find the right company, walk into the right room, say the right things, and everything would go back to the way it used to be. But reality doesn't cater to people like Olivia. Not when they have nothing left to offer, not when the safety net they always relied on has been ripped away, not when they are finally forced to stand on their own without a single hand to pull them up. She had spent the first few days in complete denial, telling herself that this was just a phase, that Ryan would call her back, that her old friends would eventually come around, that someone would step in and save her before she actually had to do something as humiliating as getting a real job. But the rent notices were piling up, her bank account was shrinking faster than she could ignore, and the world she had built for herself was crumbling with every passing second, leaving her with no choice but to do what she had always sworn she would never have to: work like the people she had spent her life looking down on. Of course, Olivia being Olivia, she wasn't about to apply for just any job, wasn't about to lower herself to something she considered beneath her, wasn't about to walk into a restaurant and pick up a tray, wasn't about to put on a uniform and stand behind a register, wasn't about to admit, even to herself, that she was now one of the people she had mocked for years. No, Olivia was convinced that she still deserved something high-level, something prestigious, something that would keep her in the circle she had always considered herself a part of, something that wouldn't make her feel like she had actually failed. So she started applying to executive positions, sending out her resume to luxury brands, high-end corporate offices, and elite firms, completely oblivious to the fact that she had no actual experience, no real skills, nothing but a degree she barely earned and a name that carried no weight outside of the shallow, superficial world she had once lived in. She would sit at coffee shops with her laptop, dressed in her designer outfits that were now months overdue on credit card payments, scrolling through listings with an air of confidence that was almost impressive, convinced that she would land something within the week, convinced that the world was still waiting for her to return. I watched it all unfold in silence, never saying a word, never offering advice, never warning her that she was walking straight into a reality check she wasn't prepared for, because this was a lesson she had to learn on her own. I knew how this was going to end, knew that rejection after rejection was waiting for her, knew that no high-powered CEO was going to look at her empty resume and think, yes, this is exactly who we need running our company. But Olivia had always believed in her own delusions more than she believed in reality, so I let her chase them, let her believe for just a little while longer that she was still untouchable, let her apply to jobs she had no chance of getting, because I knew that soon enough, the world was going to show her exactly how little it owed her. And then one day she found it. The job listing that made her eyes light up, the opportunity that felt like fate, the position that she convinced herself was meant for her. It was a role at one of the most prestigious firms she had ever come across, a company known for its influence, its luxury, its reputation for success, a place that carried the exact kind of status she craved, the exact kind of power she had lost. The salary was high, the benefits were better than anything she could have imagined, and in her mind, it was the perfect way to reclaim everything she had lost. She didn't hesitate, didn't overthink it, didn't even consider for a second that she might not be qualified. She sent in her application that same night, barely skimming the requirements, barely reading past the first few lines, barely realizing that the company she had just applied to wasn't just another corporate firm. It was mine. She had no idea that the CEO's name on the website belonged to the same brother she had spent years mocking, no idea that the man in charge of everything was the same man she had once called a nobody, no idea that she had just unknowingly put her entire future in the hands of the very person she had spent her life looking down on. And when the interview invitation came through, when she received that email confirming her appointment, when she looked at her reflection in the mirror and smiled to herself, convinced that she was finally back on the right path, she had no idea that she was walking straight into the biggest wake-up call of her life. I sat in my office that night, staring at her name on the interview schedule, the irony of it all settling over me like a weight I never expected to carry, the satisfaction mixing with something else, something almost unrecognizable, something that felt dangerously close to pity. Olivia had always thought she was untouchable, had always believed that she was better than everyone else, had always convinced herself that she would never have to live in a world where people like me had power over people like her. But now, for the first time in her life, she was at my mercy. And I wasn't sure yet if I wanted to teach her a lesson or let her drown in the one the world was already giving her. Olivia had always walked into places like she owned them, head held high, confidence radiating off her like an expensive perfume, convinced that the world was always one step away from handing her exactly what she wanted. This time was no different. She stepped through the gleaming glass doors of the corporate headquarters, taking in the marble floors, the towering windows, the minimalist decor that screamed exclusivity, and smiled to herself, as if she had already won. To her, this was nothing more than another step toward reclaiming the life she had lost, another opportunity to remind the world that she belonged among the elite, another chance to prove that she was meant for something more than the mediocrity she had been forced to endure. She didn't notice the name etched into the glass near the reception desk, didn't glance at the framed articles lining the hallway, didn't stop to read the company's history displayed proudly near the elevators. If she had, she might have seen it. If she had been paying attention, she might have felt the first stirrings of suspicion. If she had taken a second to look beyond her own reflection in the polished surfaces, she might have realized that the name attached to this empire, the name that appeared on every legal document, every plaque, every executive memo, was one she had spent her whole life underestimating. But Olivia never paid attention to details that didn't serve her, never looked beyond what she thought was important, never considered the possibility that she could be walking into a trap of her own making. I watched from my office as she approached the receptionist, her heels clicking against the floor, her posture perfect, her voice carrying just the right amount of confidence without seeming desperate. She had perfected this act years ago, the art of making herself seem like the obvious choice, the woman who should be hired not because she was the most qualified but because she belonged in a place like this. She didn't even consider the possibility of rejection, didn't entertain the thought that she might not be as indispensable as she believed, didn't realize that the decision had already been made long before she ever stepped foot in this building. "Olivia Carter," she said smoothly, flashing a practiced smile at the receptionist, placing her designer handbag gently on the counter like it was a symbol of status, as if the brand alone should be enough to grant her respect. "I have an interview scheduled with Karen Mitchell." The receptionist, a woman who had seen more arrogant job candidates than she could count, barely glanced up as she typed something into her computer. Her expression neutral, unimpressed, giving Olivia none of the validation she had come to expect from people who worked in lesser positions. Olivia's smile faltered for just a second before she recovered, adjusting her stance slightly, trying to exude charm, trying to re-establish control over the moment. I leaned back in my chair, amused, watching as the receptionist finally directed her toward the executive floor, watching as she straightened her posture, flipped her hair over her shoulder, and walked toward the elevators like she was ascending to a throne she had always assumed would be hers. The irony of it all was almost too much to handle. She had no idea. Not a single clue. She stepped into the elevator, completely unaware that the company she was so eager to impress, the one she had chosen because of its wealth, its status, its reputation for success, belonged to the same nobody she had spent years mocking. And now, she was about to beg for a job in my empire. The moment the elevator doors closed behind her, I exhaled slowly, letting the reality of the situation settle over me, letting the satisfaction mix with something more complicated, something I hadn't quite figured out yet. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, wasn't just about proving a point, wasn't just about watching her squirm. It was about control, about power, about knowing that, for the first time in our lives, I was the one who held her future in my hands. Karen Mitchell, my head of hiring, was already waiting when Olivia stepped into her office. Her fingers laced together on the desk, her expression unreadable as she studied the woman sitting across from her. Karen was sharp, direct, not easily impressed by surface-level confidence, the kind of woman who had worked her way up from nothing and had no patience for entitlement. She had seen Olivia's resume, had raised an eyebrow at the lack of real experience, had noted the gaps filled with vague references to networking and personal brand management, and had already decided that this interview was going to be more entertaining than productive. "So, Olivia," Karen said, glancing at her resume before setting it aside, leaning forward slightly, watching her carefully. "Tell me why you think you're a good fit for this company." Olivia smiled, crossing her legs, tilting her head just enough to seem confident without seeming arrogant, a move she had probably perfected after years of getting what she wanted with charm alone. "Well," she began, her voice smooth, rehearsed, dripping with the same effortless self-assurance she had always carried. "I've always had a natural talent for leadership, and I believe my experience in high-end social circles has given me a unique ability to build relationships with influential clients. I thrive in environments where prestige and excellence are valued, and I see myself as someone who can bring a fresh perspective to this company's brand." Karen didn't react, didn't nod, didn't give Olivia the encouragement she was expecting. Instead, she tapped her fingers lightly against the desk, her gaze steady, unblinking, making Olivia shift slightly in her seat. "And by experience in high-end social circles," Karen said slowly. "You mean?" Olivia hesitated, just for a second, just long enough for Karen to see the first crack in her confidence. "I've attended exclusive events, built connections with important figures, and maintained a personal brand that aligns with the standards of elite business culture," she answered, her smile still in place, though it was slightly tighter now. Karen exhaled softly, glancing at the resume again before setting it aside completely. "I see," she said, her voice giving nothing away. "And what experience do you have managing actual business operations? Budgets, strategic planning, leading teams, things like that?" Olivia's smile didn't fade, but the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes was unmistakable. "I've always been a quick learner," she said, the first sign of nervousness creeping into her voice. "And I'm confident that my ability to adapt will make me an asset to this company." Karen leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms, tilting her head slightly as she studied Olivia, the silence stretching long enough to make her shift uncomfortably. "Interesting," she murmured. "And do you know who owns this company?" Olivia blinked, caught off guard, shaking her head slightly, clearly not expecting the question. I know it's a highly respected firm," she said, forcing another smile. "But I haven't had the chance to research the ownership in detail." Karen didn't say anything, just let the words hang in the air for a moment before reaching for a folder, flipping it open, and pulling out a document with the company's leadership listed at the top. She slid it across the desk, tapping her finger next to a single name, watching as Olivia's eyes flickered over the page, watching as the blood drained from her face the second she read the name printed in bold letters. Daniel Carter, CEO. For the first time in her life, Olivia was speechless. And for the first time in my life, I watched from my office, knowing that this was only the beginning. Olivia had always believed that success was something that could be seen, something that had to be displayed like a trophy, something that came with designer clothes, luxury cars, extravagant vacations, and rooms filled with people who existed only to admire you. To her, wealth wasn't just about financial security, it was about power, about status, about making sure that everyone around you knew just how important you were. That was why she had never once looked at me as someone worth taking seriously, never considered the possibility that I could have built something of real value, never thought for even a second that I could have been living in a world she had always assumed was meant for her. But life has a way of humbling people like Olivia, and today she was about to realize just how wrong she had been. The call came early in the morning, the kind of call that should have made her stop and think, should have made her wonder if maybe, just maybe, this had all been too easy. She had walked out of her interview feeling confident, convinced that her charm had been enough to impress, that her fabricated experience had been enough to get her through, that the woman sitting across from her desk had seen her as the asset Olivia believed herself to be. She had barely made it home before her phone rang, before an unfamiliar number flashed across the screen, before she picked up with the kind of excitement that only comes when you truly believe that the world still owes you something. "Miss Carter," the voice on the other end said, professional, polite, just detached enough to let her know that this was business, nothing personal. "We're pleased to inform you that you've been selected for the position." For a second, Olivia didn't say anything, didn't even breathe, the words settling over her like a shield against everything she had lost, like proof that she had been right all along, that she was still meant for something greater, that she had never truly fallen from grace. And then, just as quickly as the silence came, it was broken by the sound of her laughter. Light, victorious, the kind of laugh that came from someone who had won. "I knew it," she murmured, half to herself, barely able to contain her satisfaction. "I just knew they'd see what I have to offer." She spent the rest of the day celebrating, treating herself to a shopping spree she couldn't afford, posting vague but triumphant messages on social media, letting the world know that she had secured her future, that her struggles had only been temporary, that she was exactly where she was meant to be. She didn't stop to question why the company had moved so quickly, why the position had been handed to her with so little hesitation, why something that should have been difficult had felt so effortless. Because in Olivia's world, things were always supposed to work out for her, always supposed to bend in her favor, always supposed to lead her exactly where she wanted to go. She walked into her first day of work with that same unshakable confidence, dressed to impress, her head held high, ready to prove to the world that she belonged here, that she had never truly fallen, that she had always been destined for success. She didn't notice the way people glanced at her when she walked in, didn't pick up on the knowing smiles, the amused whispers, the quiet exchanges between employees who were already in on a joke she hadn't realized she was part of. She was too busy soaking in the atmosphere, too focused on reclaiming her place among the elite, too blinded by her own sense of self-importance to see the truth staring her in the face. And then the meeting started. The conference room was sleek, modern, every inch of it designed to project authority, power, control. Olivia took her seat with practiced ease, crossing her legs, smoothing out her dress, flashing the same confident smile she had always worn in rooms full of people she wanted to impress. She didn't ask who was leading the meeting, didn't bother to check the agenda, didn't even glance at the nameplate on the seat at the head of the table. Because to her it didn't matter. She was here. She had won. The door opened, and I walked in. I didn't rush, didn't speak right away, didn't do anything but let the moment stretch as I stepped inside, as I took my time walking toward my seat, as I felt the weight of Olivia's silence crash into the room like a thunderclap. I didn't have to look at her to know exactly what was happening, didn't have to see her face to know that her mind was racing, that her breath had caught in her throat, that she was trying, and failing, to make sense of what she was seeing. I sat down at the head of the table, adjusted my cufflinks, leaned back slightly in my chair, and then finally looked directly at her. "Good morning, everyone," I said, my voice even, controlled, laced with just enough amusement to let her know that I had been waiting for this moment. "Let's get started." The color drained from her face so fast I almost thought she might pass out. She blinked, once, twice, her lips parting slightly, her entire body going rigid as she struggled to process what was happening. "Daniel," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, so quiet that it might have gone unnoticed if the entire room hadn't fallen into complete, expectant silence. I tilted my head slightly, my smile sharp, unyielding. "That's Mr. Carter to you," I corrected, watching as the words hit her like a slap, as her expression twisted into something close to disbelief, as she realized, far too late, that she had walked straight into a world she didn't understand. She glanced around the room, searching for confirmation, for some kind of explanation, for anything that would make this make sense, but all she found were employees who were waiting to see how this played out, people who had already put the pieces together, people who had known the truth from the moment she walked through the door. She started, but whatever excuse she had been about to make, whatever lie she had been about to tell, whatever desperate attempt she had been about to reach for, died in her throat when she saw the look in my eyes. Because, for the first time in her life, she wasn't the one in control. For the first time I was the one holding all the power. For the first time she was looking at me, not as the brother she had spent years mocking, not as the man she had dismissed as a nobody, not as the person she had always assumed would stay beneath her. She was looking at me as the man who owned the company she had just begged for a job at. And there was nothing she could do about it. Olivia had always been good at talking her way out of things, at twisting a situation until she was the victim, at making excuses that painted her as misunderstood rather than accountable. She had spent her whole life using charm as a weapon, using arrogance as a shield, using manipulation as a way to keep herself above the consequences of her own actions. But for the first time, she was trapped in a reality she couldn't control, backed into a corner where there was no easy escape, no wealthy fiancé to rescue her, no high society connections to smooth things over, no false confidence that could erase the undeniable truth. She had built her identity on the illusion of superiority, and now, she had to face the fact that the man she had once mocked had become the one thing she never expected. Her boss. The meeting had ended in thick, suffocating silence, a silence that followed her down the hallway, that clung to her skin, that weighed down every step she took as she tried to process the sheer humiliation of what had just happened. She had come in believing she was securing her future, believing she had finally found a way back to the life she had lost, believing that she was still special, still meant for something greater, still untouchable in the way she had always assumed. But now, the world had flipped upside down, turned inside out, shattered beneath her feet, leaving her exposed in a way she had never been before. I had watched her leave the conference room, her shoulders stiff, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin line as she tried to hold onto whatever scraps of dignity she had left. She hadn't said a word to me, hadn't tried to argue, hadn't attempted to spin the moment into something that suited her, because there was no spinning this, no way to rewrite the story, no way to pretend that what had just happened wasn't real. She had walked in expecting to impress a room full of executives. Instead, she had learned that the company she so desperately wanted to work for belonged to the same brother she had spent years calling a nobody. She didn't even make it an hour before she showed up outside my office. I heard the hesitant knock on the door, the first knock in years that didn't carry the smug entitlement she usually brought into every conversation, the first knock that told me she wasn't sure what would happen next. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly, letting the moment stretch, letting her sit in the discomfort of knowing she had to ask for something instead of demand it, letting her realize that she was walking into a conversation where she no longer held a single ounce of control. "Come in," I said finally, my voice even, unreadable. She stepped inside, closing the door behind her with a quiet click, standing just a little too still, as if she wasn't sure whether she was supposed to sit down or remain where she was. For the first time, there was hesitation in her movements, uncertainty in her posture, doubt in the way she looked at me, like she was seeing me for the first time not as her brother, but as a man she didn't fully understand. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, shifting on her feet, forcing a breath through her nose before finally speaking. "Daniel," she said, her voice softer than usual, lacking the usual sharp edge of superiority. "I think we need to talk." I didn't respond immediately, just watched her, waiting, letting her sit in the silence, letting her feel the weight of the moment, letting her realize that this wasn't going to be easy, that I wasn't going to make it easy. She exhaled sharply, running a hand through her perfectly styled hair, her nails tapping against her palm as she searched for the right words. "Look, I know this must be strange for you," she started, forcing a small, brittle laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "I mean, I had no idea this was your company." I tilted my head slightly, raising an eyebrow. "Would it have mattered?" I asked, my voice calm, measured, dissecting her with nothing more than a few simple words. "If you had known, would you have treated this opportunity any differently?" Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to protest, as if she wanted to argue, as if she wanted to reach for some excuse that would make all of this go away. But there was nothing to reach for, nothing to grab onto, nothing she could say that would change the reality of what had already happened. She began, but I didn't let her finish. "You walked in here thinking you deserved a high-paying position, assuming that your presence alone was enough to justify a job," I continued, my tone sharp, cutting through whatever narrative she was trying to build for herself. "You didn't bother to research the company, didn't even glance at the leadership, didn't take a second to consider whether you were actually qualified for the role you applied for. You assumed success was yours simply because you wanted it." She flinched just slightly, but it was enough. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk, keeping my gaze locked onto hers. "Tell me something, Olivia," I said, my voice quieter now, more deliberate. "If this had been any other company, if I wasn't sitting here in this chair, do you think you would have gotten this job?" Silence. Pure. Deafening. Silence. For the first time she had no answer. A sharp knock on the door interrupted the moment, and before Olivia could even attempt to compose herself, Karen Mitchell stepped inside, holding a file in one hand. Her expression carefully neutral but her eyes sharp, assessing the tension in the room immediately. "Mr. Carter," she said, glancing at Olivia briefly before turning back to me. "Can I speak with you for a moment?" I nodded, gesturing for her to continue. Karen stepped closer, setting the file on my desk. I've reviewed Olivia's interview notes and qualifications, she said, her voice professional but firm. And while she presents herself well, I have some concerns. Olivia stiffened, but Karen didn't acknowledge her reaction, keeping her focus on me. She lacks direct experience in business operations, hasn't demonstrated leadership in any significant capacity. And, well, to be frank, she carries an air of entitlement that could be disruptive in a corporate environment. I didn't react, didn't let my expression change, didn't let Olivia see whether or not I agreed, because I wanted her to feel this, wanted her to sit in the reality of a situation she could no longer manipulate. Karen cleared her throat, adjusting her stance. With all due respect, Mr. Carter, I don't believe she's the right fit for this company. Olivia inhaled sharply, her eyes darting to me, waiting, hoping, desperate for an answer that would give her a way out. I exhaled slowly, tapping my fingers against the desk, letting the moment stretch just a little longer, letting her see that her future no longer rested in her hands, it rested in mine. And now, the only question left was whether I wanted to let her stay, or finally make her face the consequences of her past. The weight of uncertainty settled over Olivia like a storm cloud, pressing down on her shoulders, suffocating in its intensity, making every breath feel like it carried the weight of her future. She had spent her whole life walking through the world as if it belonged to her, as if opportunities would always be handed to her, as if no matter how badly she screwed up, there would always be a way to charm, manipulate, or talk her way out of the consequences. But now, for the first time, she had no control over what happened next, no power to change the outcome, no way to undo the choices that had led her here. For the past week, she had moved through the office like a ghost, her usual confidence dimmed, her presence quieter, her posture stiffer, as if she was bracing for the moment I would finally decide to end this game and send her walking out of the building for good. She didn't know what I was thinking, didn't know whether I planned to keep her on or fire her, didn't know whether I was waiting for her to fail or giving her a chance to prove herself, and the not knowing was driving her insane. She had never feared rejection before, had never worried about being cast aside, had never even considered the possibility that someone might look at her and say, "You're not good enough." But now, the reality of it hung over her like a guillotine, and no matter how much she tried to hold on to whatever dignity she had left, I could see the cracks forming, see the quiet panic in her eyes every time she passed my office, see the way her fingers trembled slightly whenever she typed on her computer, see the way she hesitated before speaking in meetings, as if waiting for me to call her out in front of everyone. She was learning what it felt like to be powerless, to be at the mercy of someone else's decision, to live in the uncertainty of knowing that her fate depended entirely on the judgment of a person she had spent years believing was beneath her. And then, just as I had expected, our mother got involved. Lisa called me late in the evening, long after the office had emptied out, long after Olivia had gone home to whatever cramped apartment she was barely managing to hold on to, long after I had finally started to settle into the satisfaction of knowing that, for once, I was the one in control. I knew before I even answered what the conversation would be about. Knew before I even heard her voice that she was about to plead Olivia's case. Knew before she even took her first breath that she was going to ask me to do something I wasn't sure I wanted to do. "Daniel," she said, her voice soft, careful, as if she knew that one wrong word might push me in the opposite direction. "Can we talk about Olivia?" I exhaled slowly, rubbing my temple, already knowing exactly how this conversation was going to go. "What about her?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral, waiting to see how much she was going to beg, how much she was going to excuse, how much she was going to try and make me feel like the bad guy for finally making Olivia face the consequences of her own arrogance. Lisa hesitated, just for a moment, as if debating how to phrase what she wanted to say, as if trying to find the right balance between concern and persuasion. "She's struggling," she admitted finally, her voice laced with something dangerously close to guilt. "I know she's made mistakes, I know she hasn't always been kind to you, but she's your sister, Daniel. She's family." I let out a bitter laugh, shaking my head slightly, gripping the phone just a little tighter. "Now she's family?" I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Was she family when she mocked me for years? Was she family when she called me a nobody? Was she family when she sat at dinner, laughing at the fact that I wasn't successful enough for her standards? Lisa sighed, the kind of sigh that carried decades of maternal exhaustion, the kind of sigh that meant she was about to try and make me feel guilty for wanting justice. "She's learning," she said softly. "She's finally seeing the real world, Daniel. And maybe this is the moment she changes." I closed my eyes for a second, leaning back in my chair, letting her words sink in, letting myself wonder if that was even possible, If Olivia could change, if someone who had spent their entire life believing they were better than everyone else could suddenly wake up and realize they weren't. She needs to hear it from you, Lisa continued, her voice gentle, pushing but not forcing, knowing that she couldn't demand this from me, knowing that it had to be my choice. She needs to know what you're thinking, needs to know whether she's being given a second chance or just waiting for the axe to drop. She's scared, Daniel. And I don't think I've ever seen her truly scared before. That was the part that caught me off guard. I had seen Olivia angry, seen her arrogant, seen her manipulative, seen her fake sincerity when it benefited her, seen her play the role of the victim when she wanted sympathy. But scared. That was new. I sighed, running a hand through my hair, knowing that no matter how much I wanted to ignore this, I wouldn't be able to, knowing that there was only one way this would end. Olivia and I, face to face, having a conversation that neither of us wanted to have. I called her the next morning, told her to come to my office before work started, gave her no indication of what I was going to say, no hint of whether she should be preparing for an apology or a termination notice. When she walked in, she was already bracing herself, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, her posture straight but tense, her lips pressed together like she was holding back everything she wanted to say. I didn't speak right away, just let the silence stretch, let her feel the weight of it, let her know that for once, I wasn't going to fill in the gaps for her. And then, finally, she exhaled shakily and looked at me. Really looked at me. Not like an obstacle, not like an inconvenience, not like someone she had dismissed as unimportant. I was wrong, she said, her voice quiet but steady, as if forcing herself to say it without breaking. About you, about success, about everything. I raised an eyebrow, waiting, giving her nothing. She swallowed hard, her nails digging into her palms, her face pale but determined. I thought money made people valuable, she admitted. I thought the only thing that mattered was looking successful. I thought I was better than people who worked regular jobs. But I was wrong, Daniel. And I see that now. It wasn't a plea, wasn't an excuse, wasn't another attempt to manipulate the situation. It was the first real apology she had ever given me. And now, the only question left was whether I was ready to forgive her, or if I wanted to watch her fall just a little further. The office was silent, the kind of silence that wasn't just an absence of sound but a presence of something heavier, something unspoken, something waiting. Olivia sat across from me, her back straight, her hands resting in her lap. Her face carefully composed in that way she had perfected over the years, that way that made her seem untouchable, unaffected, always in control. But she wasn't in control now, and she knew it. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment she had spent the last few weeks trying to prepare for, the moment where I would decide whether she stayed or whether she walked out of this office for the last time. And the worst part for her, the part that I could see gnawing at the edges of her forced calm, was that there was nothing she could say, nothing she could do, no amount of charm or arrogance or false confidence that would change the fact that, for once, she was entirely at the mercy of someone else. I leaned back in my chair, watching her, letting the tension sit between us, letting her feel the weight of it, letting her wonder what I was thinking, letting her sit in the same uncertainty that she had forced so many others to feel over the years. You know why you're here, I said finally, my voice steady, offering no hints, no clues as to which way this conversation would go. She swallowed, barely noticeable, just the faintest tightening of her throat, but I saw it. I assume this is where you decide whether I keep my job, she said, her tone measured, careful, walking the fine line between humility and self-preservation. I didn't answer right away, just studied her, watching the way she held herself, the way she was forcing herself not to fidget, the way she was bracing for the worst while still trying to convince herself she could handle whatever I threw at her. I could fire you, I said, the words slow, deliberate, letting them settle between us, watching the way her fingers curled just slightly in her lap, as if preparing to tighten into fists. I could tell Karen that her instincts were right, that you aren't the right fit for this company, that you don't belong here. And I wouldn't be wrong. Her jaw clenched, just for a second, just enough for me to see that she was biting back the immediate reaction, the instinct to defend herself, to argue, to insist that she was more than what she had been reduced to. But I'm not going to do that, I continued, letting the words hang in the air, watching as a flicker of something, relief, confusion, suspicion, passed through her expression. She didn't speak, didn't interrupt, didn't demand an explanation, and that in itself was proof that she had changed, at least a little. You want to work here? I asked, raising an eyebrow, letting the question sink in, letting her understand that this wasn't a gift, wasn't an act of kindness, wasn't me going easy on her just because we shared the same blood. Fine. But you're going to earn it. Her brows furrowed slightly, the first real crack in her composure. What does that mean? It means you're not starting as an executive, I said, my tone firm, unwavering, making sure she knew there was no negotiation, no loophole, no way around it. You're not walking into a leadership role just because you think you deserve it. You're starting at the bottom, entry level, just like everyone else. She inhaled sharply, and for a second I thought she might fight it, might argue, might let that old Olivia resurface just long enough to demand that she was worth more, that she wasn't some intern, that she deserved better. But then, just as quickly, I saw something shift in her eyes, something I hadn't seen before, something that looked dangerously close to understanding. She nodded once, slowly, deliberately, as if the weight of reality was finally settling on her shoulders. "Okay," she said, her voice quieter than usual, lacking its usual sharp edge, carrying something that almost sounded like acceptance. I leaned forward slightly, resting my elbows on my desk, making sure she saw the seriousness in my expression, making sure she understood that this wasn't some punishment, wasn't about humiliating her, wasn't about making her suffer just for the sake of revenge. "This isn't a handout," I told her, my voice even, steady. "This isn't me saving you. This is you proving that you're more than what you've pretended to be for years." She swallowed hard, nodding again, slower this time, her gaze dropping for just a second before she forced herself to meet mine again. "I get it," she said, and for the first time I believed that she actually did. Silence stretched between us again, but this time it wasn't heavy with tension. It was something else, something unfamiliar, something that felt like the beginning of something different. I exhaled slowly, leaning back in my chair, watching as she sat there. No longer the sister who had once mocked me, no longer the woman who had believed she was better than everyone else, no longer the person who had thought success was something that could be bought instead of earned. "Your desk is on the second floor," I said, nodding toward the door. "Your new supervisor is expecting you in an hour." She stood slowly, smoothing out her dress, squaring her shoulders, but there was no arrogance in the way she held herself, no entitlement in the way she moved, no superiority in the way she carried her presence. There was only quiet acceptance, only the understanding that this was her only shot, only the knowledge that she was lucky to even have this much. She turned toward the door but hesitated just before opening it, glancing back at me, something unreadable in her expression. "Thank you," she said, the words hesitant but sincere, the kind of words that had never come easily to her, the kind of words that meant more than I was willing to admit. I didn't respond, didn't need to, just gave her a small nod, just enough to let her know that I had heard her, that I understood, that maybe, just maybe, things weren't as broken between us as they had once seemed. As the door closed behind her, I exhaled slowly, running a hand through my hair, letting the weight of the moment settle over me, letting myself wonder if I had made the right decision. Because in the end, revenge might have felt good in the moment, might have been satisfying in its own way, might have given me the kind of justice I had once craved. But maybe true power wasn't about making someone suffer. Maybe true power was giving them the chance to change. Is true revenge letting them suffer, or giving them a chance to change?